At Matt Burke _1976 asks, how do we start practicing compassion to our little self? Thank you, Geoff.
Matt, one of my most favourite people in the world. I love Matt Burke. What you do, Matt, is you get rid of the little self. That's what you do. You don't need the little self, because while there's a self there, we're going to be selfish. So we work on reducing the little self. So eventually we are just an observing eye, what you could call the soul, and we're just a vessel for the divine. We're a vessel for God. So we follow a divine commandment or a divine covenant. I've written about this in the Divine CEO. So the idea is that we gradually, bit by bit, remove everything till we are situated in the self, and then we remove the self. And that's a gradual thing. It happens by piecemeal. We don't want it all yanked at once. There's a lovely line in the Old Testament where God says to Moses, I won't take all of your demons out of you in 1 year. So we're saying this transition from negative perception to consciousness, or from negative internal parasites, wounds and beliefs and ideologies, you're not going to take them all out at once. He's going to gradually, as you gradually break your covenant with those old habits, your consciousness will expand, and eventually your body will be inhospitable, not only for parasites but also for the idea, the concept of the self. Eventually you'll let go of the concept of God as well, because there's no man-made God. There isn't a guy in the sky with kind eyes and a beard. We go beyond the concept of God, and we go to the Ein Sof, which is the infinite, which is not describable, but you can feel it. Hopefully you're feeling it in the gaps, Matt. If you listen to the gaps, listen to the gaps. There he is.
At Mike T79 asks, do you ever think overthinking makes the world too complicated?
Well, the world is complicated. We can't get away from that. It just is. But that doesn't mean that you can't find God in the garden, in very simple things. But from my own experience, what stopped me from going is that the world is complicated, and that everything is complicated. And it's been very tiring to break through that complication in order to simplify it. So, it's a lovely thing Bruce Lee used to say is before I understood a kick was just a kick, before I understood it, a kick was just a kick and a punch was just a punch. Then when I understood it, a kick was no longer a kick and it was no longer a punch. But then once I'd mastered it, a kick was just a kick and a kick was just a punch. So we go through that simple, complicated, simple again. So some of the things that were very complicated to me, I've done the study on and done the rigor on, and or they've become very simple. And for me, I need to work out, do the working out to understand what it is I'm learning, so that I can simplify it in order to pass it on to other people. So in Judaism, they would call this Zimzum. And they say that God is too complicated and too vast to be understood. So he reduces himself to a point where it's understandable. And when it's understandable, it still has the essence of God and you can pass it on. So what I try to do is I try to understand things as much as possible and then reduce them. I would try to understand them as much as possible. Like if you read the Zohar, for instance, it's very esoteric, it's very complex. And you won't understand it. It's written in a way like you don't understand it. But when I say I finished reading the Zohar, I took 70 or 80 pages of notes that were complicated and that weren't linked. I was able to reduce those notes by going over them and over them until eventually I was left with one concept, which was breath. So the whole of the Zohar taught me the importance of breath. So what was complicated became very simple. But then the word breath is just like a seed. So what God is saying to me is take that seed, breath, just the word breath, and place it into the fertile soil of your mind and let it expand until it becomes an oak. And then that oak will grow, and on top of that oak it will produce a million other little concepts. So the concept of breath is simple, but when you start to study breath, it's very, very complex. It goes from being just an act of respiration to the fact that you're literally bringing in and pushing out spirits all the time when you breathe. You're bringing in living energy and putting out living energy. So we can't get away from the fact that this is a massively complex world. Some of Gurdjieff's better students would say we teach all the complexities of esoteric practice, and then say to people, but to be honest with you, if you go in the garden, you could learn it probably even better just from observing nature. So some of the things that used to be when some of the things that used to be really complicated to me are very, very simple, and some of the things that feel very complicated to me at the moment, I'm working on some stuff that's making my head feels a bit like a brass band, like that, because I've got complexities that I'm being taught in order to simplify them, so I can pass them on to other people as a seed. So me and Gabriela were talking about this before we did this podcast, and we both kind of agreed that everybody's different. You might want to go and find God in the garden. I might want to find it through reams and reams of books. You might get it from hearing one sermon from a Buddhist, or you might need to read hundreds of thousands of verses. Everybody's different. So we can't get away from the fact that the world is complex, but we should never lose sight of the fact either that it's very, very simple. So I did probably hundreds of thousands of hours of martial arts before I went on the door. And nearly every complex thing I ever learnt was dismissed and thrown out because it didn't work. And the thing that did work was so simple, it was rudely offensive. Lots of people in the martial arts were offended by the fact that I found the secret to applicable martial arts. I found the secret to what works in a real life situation, and it was preemption, the preemptive attack. Now it's just simple, and people will say it can't be that simple, but it is simple. But the preemptive attack on its own is very complex. Because if I'm going to preemptively attack somebody, I need to understand the pre-fight, the in-fight, and the post-fight. I need to be able to control my own adrenals. I need to be able to develop a punch that's going to work if I'm preemptive, and I need to understand the aftermath of that, the consequences of what will happen if I punch somebody, in the law, in my own body, in that person's body. What if I kill them? A preemptive strike is so simple, but it's also very complex. So when I started teaching the preemptive strike, I would say to people, they would say, well, when do you preemptively strike? So you'd have to teach them about attack rituals. You'd have to teach them about, triggers to violence, how people become before the attack, when to attack, where to strike. It is just by the very nature of it complex. I remember writing a book on punching, and my friend said, what are you writing? I said, I'm doing a book on punching. And he said, well, what is there to say? And I showed him the first 18 chapters, and he couldn't believe how complex it was, about the angular nature of punching, and about, it is infinite. The amount of places you can go with a punch, it's infinite. But ultimately, it's just about, learning how to punch and hitting somebody. But if you want to go into the science of it, it's complicated, especially if you want to pass it on to other people. So I don't hide away from the fact that the world is complicated, but I'm also not afraid of the fact that when I reach it, when I feel it, it's simple. So people will say to you, the highest level of teaching in esoteric practice is to do nothing. They call it doing nothing. In Buddhism, this would be called dependent arising. It's basically saying that reality exists at the level of engagement. If you don't engage something, it's not going to exist. So this level of doing nothing, it's like saying, yeah, all that stuff you're doing is a waste of time. Just do nothing. But when you try and explain doing nothing to somebody, it is massively complex. Doing nothing is complex because it automatically presumes that you know what doing nothing means. It automatically presumes that you've got enough of a strong conscious will to sit and watch the passions as they merge, as they rise, as they approach, to sit in them, to understand the perceptual nature of adrenaline, the perceptual nature of reality, or the beings that are coming around you. Just to do nothing is very, very complex. So I could say to you, everything I've ever learned, I probably didn't have to leave my front room to do it. I could have just sat there and did nothing and just watched it. But everybody that teaches the art of doing nothing, all of them have gone through all of those other esoteric practices before they found that. And a lot of them, when you look at their life, they're still not able to do it now. They can say it because it's right, but it doesn't mean it's not complex. So everything is complex. So I would say, when you go into the complex and you reduce it down, you'll be left with the simple. Right? So you'll be left with the simple. But the simple is a seed that's going to flower out and be massively complex again. And that complexity is going to be reduced into a seed that is very simple. So if you look at an acorn, it is simple. But the potential in that acorn, there is the potential in that acorn to grow a 200-foot, 500-year-old oak tree that will produce another million seeds just like that one. Each of those with the potential to grow another million trees with another million. You can see what I'm saying? It's ad infinitum, it's infinite. So it is complex. There's no way of getting around that. So you end up with a very, very simple concept, breath, or a very simple concept, preemption. Where does that lead you? It leads you on to a whole other realm of knowledge that is very complex, that you reduce down to a simple form again, and then that becomes complex. And that's the exciting bit. Our ability to grow is infinite, but we have to be prepared to go through that. But you could absolutely just spend your time in the garden and learn that through nature. But like everyone, like I said, everybody's a little bit different. For me, I'm really excited about the concept of, finishing 6 months of full-time study on one book and reducing those notes to one word, and then going, that's the seed that's going to produce another million seeds, that each is going to produce another million. So my ability to continue to grow is infinite. If all that sounds too complex, and it might be for somebody, just if you want to reduce it to living a good life, be kind. Just be kind. That's a small concept. Be kind. But how do you discern what's kind and what's not kind? And what part of you is the part that's going to be kind? And what part of you doesn't want to be kind? And what part of you is confused by the fact that I'm asking you to put kindness into a world that seems to be full of cruelty? See what I mean? You can't get away from it. I've had to just, I've had to embrace it. I love it. I sit here now with simple, every now and again you'll get a simple certainty, a simple yaqeen, a simple undeniable truth that never leaves you. As I'm sitting with you now, I can feel judo grip in my hands. I can feel an ability to strike in my hands. I can feel an ability to physically control in my hands. I can feel an ability to physically heal in my hands now. I can feel that. They're certainties that are so simple that they don't need to be changed, because I've broke through all of the complexity and I've gone into this Ein Sof, this God space. So certain parts of my life will never change. So my job is just to continue to expand those parts until I feel that in everything I do. But while I'm in a physical body, that's unlikely, because the physical body is a restrictive vehicle, and it's specifically here enabled for us to enhance our ability to grow. So you just got to ask yourself, where does God want me to be? Where does he want me to learn? Does he want me to go to university, or does he want me to go into the garden? But whether you look at the microcosm or the macrocosm, it is complex. But if it's all too much, just try to live your life as kindly as possible.
At J O'Neill 01 asks, how did you deal with any negative or foreboding thoughts pertaining to your mortality?
At first, I just let them intimidate me. I let them frighten me, and I ran away from them, and they hid, and I lived fearfully. Then when I built my fear pyramid, if you get a chance to look at my book, Fear the Friend of Exceptional People, if there's anybody out there watching this who can't afford the book, please contact Gabriela, my Instagram manager, and she'll send you a free copy of the PDF. So I'm not trying to sell the book here, but if you get a chance to look at that, That was about me. That was about me looking at all of the things I was frightened of and turning into them. So whatever frightened me, the sharp edges that were intimidating to me, I leaned into them. And I learned that if I was able to sit in them without identifying and without reacting and without engaging them, just watch them, watch the feelings and watch the thoughts, I recognised that they were temporal. They weren't real. They had no life if I didn't engage them. So I started to look for the things that didn't change. So all of the things that rose and fell, all of the things that approached and moved away were temporal. They felt real and they felt threatening. They felt like three-dimensional monsters. But when I just watched them and didn't engage them, I noticed that it fell away. So I started to search for the thing in my life that was permanent. There's a lovely line in the Old Testament that says, I am Hashem. I do not change. Hashem is one of the Judaic words for God. So it's saying, find the part in your life that is permanent, that is fixed, that does not change. That's in you. That's actually in you now as we speak. You should hear it in the gaps when I'm talking. The part that's permanent. So you access that part and you recognise that everything other than that isn't real, it's temporal. And if we don't engage it, eventually it'll have no reality. But if we do engage it, it incarnates in us and we give it a reality through us. So I learned to recognise that an open wound is an open doorway. A fear is a cross that marks treasure. Anxiety is a question that needs to be answered. Depression is something that's depressed inside me that wants to find its way out. Everything is an opportunity to grow. Everything is an opportunity to learn, providing we have the courage to lean into the sharp edges, providing we have the courage to turn into it instead of turning away. And when we do that, we go through another doorway, another dimension. And then we recognise that all of the things that we're afraid of are perceptions. And perceptions can be dissolved back into their component parts and rebuilt or replaced with better conceptions. They can be converted into something beautiful. So I would just say that, and I don't mean this in a conceited or an arrogant way, if you've got anxieties or fears in your life or depressions, congratulations. Something is speaking to you, and that is a doorway. It's a doorway for you to go through. It's a doorway of investigation. And the moment the brain has a strange neurological quirk, it can't deal with fear and curiosity at the same time. So if we start to be curious about the feelings that rise in us, about the thoughts that approach us, and start to investigate them, they will notice that you're being curious. They'll notice that you're not engaging them with fear, and they'll either move away or they'll give you their treasure. So thoughts aren't in us, they're around us. They're living thought forms, living beings, living entities, living spirits. And we have to learn to choose whether we engage them or not. We think that thoughts are in us, but the thoughts aren't in us, they're outside. If we engage them, of course, they're inside us, and we cogitate and churn them around, but until we engage them, they don't exist, not in us anyway. So this is the thing that Sri Aurobindo talked about, that transformed his life when he recognised, or he was taught, that fears existed outside of him, not inside of him. They were separate entities, separate beings, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them indifferent. And he learned to choose whether or not he engaged them. So he could create an arc or an eye within himself, and he could sit there and observe the world. When the thoughts rise or when the fears approach, just lean into the sharp edges. If you can absorb 99% of those feelings without engaging them, without identifying with them, just watch them, they will dissipate. That's the practice. And Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now, is the leading book in the world at the moment on this technique. So if you get a chance to look at The Power of Now.